like all the topics that we talked about. And the other is your specific essay questions that could appear on the midterm exam. There's 2 pages. And this is on Monday, the 8th of May. So it's not next Monday, but it is the following Monday. So remember that we don't have lab this week, but we have a lab practical next week. So remember to study your cranial nerves, to study your brain diagrams, and also your spinal nerves that you need to know. Not spinal nerves, but peripheral nerves.
So it's just the nerves.
And nervous tissues. Everything, so I would just study the handouts from lab, as well as the handout that I gave you on Wednesday, which had the diagrams of the nerves in the upper arm and lower leg. But remember that you also have to know the cranial nerves on the diagram as well as on the skull. Not on the skull.
It's already lab note for you Friday or Monday.
Oh, that's a good question. I'll have it due on Monday.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll have you turn in your lab notebook when you turn in your midterm exam. Okay, so our last major topic is the autonomic nervous system, which is abbreviated as the ANS. And you want to remember that the ANS is actually part of your peripheral nervous system. So this is part of the peripheral nervous system. So if I was to do my flow chart, which is in the very beginning of this chapter, remember that the PNS consists of sensory division. We talked about some skin senses and senses in joints and muscles. We are going to, after the midterm, we're going to talk about sensory special senses, which include the eye and the ear, for example. And then we also have the motor division. So the motor division can be broken down into somatic. So this involves motor neurons that innervate skeletal muscle. Okay, so that's the somatic division of the motor nervous system. And then here we have the autonomic nervous system. So the ANS. And rather than including neurons that innervate skeletal muscle, this involves the innervation of organs that have smooth muscle in them. So we'll put of organs, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So do you remember what type of neurotransmitter do motor neurons release into the synapse with skeletal muscles? What is the neurotransmitter that's released by motor neurons and causes skeletal muscles to contract? So it's excitatory. It's the one that is affected by the nerve gas serin. So you remember what that one was? Everybody remembers? It's abbreviated ACH, right? So this is what? What is ACH? Acetylcholine, right? So if we look at the neurotransmitter, right? This is acetylcholine. So remember that acetylcholine in this particular instance is excitatory in the somatic. So underneath the somatic, motor neurons release acetylcholine, and this is excitatory. So excitatory at the synapse with skeletal muscles. Okay. Now, also in the somatic nervous system, we have myelination. And what is the myelination produced by? Schwann cells. So Schwann cells wrap themselves around the axons. And so these motor neurons are heavily myelinated. So the axons are heavily myelinated. Okay, so this is kind of a review. Okay. And the other thing that is important to remember about the somatic division is that the nerve cell bodies reside in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and then the axons come out and they travel all the way to the muscles. So we'll say that the nerve cell bodies reside in the spinal cord, specifically the ventral horn. I'll put ventral horn, horn of spinal cord. Okay. So we're going to compare this to what we see in the autonomic nervous system. Okay. So if we look at a diagram that shows the difference, okay, here is what we just talked about. So here's the very top here. This is the somatic division. And so you can see that it's just showing that the nerve cell bodies are residing in the spinal cord. They're heavily myelinated. They release acetylcholine, and their effector is in skeletal muscles, and they are stimulatory. Okay. So the difference between this and what we see in the autonomic nervous system is now we see that there's not just a single neuron going out to the effectors, but there's actually a chain of neurons. So we have two neurons that extend out into the body, and the nerve cell bodies reside in ganglia that are outside of the central nervous system. So let's go back to the ANS anatomy. Oops. Okay, so ANS anatomy. Okay, so we have two neurons, two neuron chain, right? And so the first neuron is called the preganglionic neuron. So this is coming out of the spinal cord. So the preganglionic neuron, the nucleus of the cell body, so we just put the cell body resides in the lateral horn. Of the spinal cord, lateral horn of spinal cord. So the lateral horn, and I'll show you a picture of it in a second, is between the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. There's a little horn that kind of sticks out, and that is not part of the somatic division, but it's part of the autonomic division, okay? So then this extends to the ganglia. So the ganglia, remember, is only found in the PNS. So this is the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. And so the ganglia are bundles of nerve cell bodies that exist outside of the central nervous system, so outside of the spinal cord, for example. And then from the ganglia, they go to the organ, and they travel via the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so this is what synapses with the effector. Okay, so that's what synapses is with, like the stomach muscles, the muscles that surround your blood vessels, the muscles, or excuse me, the glands, the lacrimal glands in your eyes, your salivary glands, right, your adrenal glands. Okay, so that's the postganglionic neuron. So if we look at this preganglionic neuron, it is lightly myelinated. So it doesn't have nearly as much myelination as the motor neurons of the somatic division. And then these are actually unmyelinated. So the autonomic nervous system, the response of the autonomic nervous system would therefore be slower than the responses of our somatic nervous system. So our ability to move our muscles is quicker than our ability to like regulate the production of saliva, right? So there's a little bit of delay there when we start thinking about food and when we start to salivate. Okay, so it's unmyelinated. Okay, so when we look at the preganglionic fibers, they all release acetylcholine. Okay. So they all release acetylcholine. When we look at the postganglionic neurons, and this is always excitatory, here. When we look at the postganglionic neurons, it depends upon which division that we're looking at. So if we're talking about parasympathetic, this releases acetylcholine. And in this case, acetylcholine could either be inhibitory or excitatory. So it is inhibitory or excitatory, depending upon the synapse. Right? So the sympathetic nervous system doesn't release acetylcholine. The postganglionic neuron doesn't release acetylcholine. It uses norepinephrine, and norepinephrine can be abbreviated as NE. So it releases norepinephrine. And again, this is inhibitory, I'll just abbreviate this, or excitatory, depending upon what it is synapsing with. So just to give you an example of this, when your parasympathetic nervous system synapses with your heart, it releases acetylcholine. But the acetylcholine causes your heart rate to decrease. So in that instance, acetylcholine is inhibitory. When your sympathetic nervous system innervates with your salivary glands, that actually shuts down saliva and gives you your dry mouth when you're nervous or embarrassed or excited. And so therefore, in the sympathetic nervous system, norepinephrine is not always excitatory. In its synapse with your salivary glands, it's actually inhibitory. So that diagram that I showed you actually has all of this information on it. And so it's very nicely summarized in this diagram, okay? So if we look at this, the nerve cell bodies, lateral horn, right? So right here, these are the nerve cell bodies. These are the ganglia. And so when we look at the ganglia, we can determine whether or not the ganglia is close to the central nervous system or whether it is far away. Notice that the ganglia are lightly myelinated, but the postganglionic neurons do not have any myelination. So here we see acetylcholine being released by the parasympathetic system, and here we see norepinephrine being released by the sympathetic nervous system. And so that shows that they can be both excitatory and or inhibitory depending upon the receptors, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that they bind to. Okay. Okay, so the other thing that I want to mention here is that when we compare the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, so if we look at the parasympathetic, okay, in the parasympathetic, we say that the ganglia are actually close to the organs where they innervate, okay? So ganglia are close to innervated organs. And so what that means is that their preganglionic axons are long. because they have to extend almost all the way to the organs that they're innervating. So here, notice that this is a long preganglionic axon, and then this is a short preganglionic axon, okay? So the postganglionic axon is short. Are short, maybe would be a better way to write, okay? And so in the sympathetic, it is exactly the opposite. So in the sympathetic, the ganglia are near the spinal cord. So they're not near the organs that they innervate, but rather they almost immediately go to ganglia that line up next to the spinal cord, right? And then they go out to the organs that they innervate. So I'll just say that the preganglionic are short, postganglionic long. So it's just the opposite. Okay. So that is kind of the anatomy, the structure of the autonomic nervous system versus the somatic, and then the difference between the divisions of the ANS. Okay, so one other thing that's important to realize is that when we look at where the information is coming from, the parasympathetic, and I'll write this down in a minute, but notice that the parasympathetic nervous system originates from the cranial region. So there's some cranial nerves here that are parasympathetic, and that was kind of in your table that you got in lab, which ones were parasympathetic, and then some are sacral, okay? So notice that this is completely the opposite in the sympathetic division. So there's no cranial nerves that are sympathetic, but rather all of the spinal nerves that are part of the sympathetic division come off the thoracic and the lumbar region of the spinal cord. And then you can see that these are the ganglia, and they run parallel to the spinal cord, right? So short preganglionic axons, and long postganglionic axons. Okay, so let's look specifically at the parasympathetic, okay? So this is sometimes referred to as the D division, right? So D, right, stands for digestion, defecation, and diuresis. What does diuresis mean? Does anybody remember? What does it mean? Actually, it's primarily urination. So diuresis is urination. You get rid of some nitrogenous waste, that's called excretion. But diuresis would be urination. Okay, so this is also just rest and relaxation. Okay. It has what is called a cranial sacral outflow. So the sacrum and the cranium region is where the nerves of the parasympathetic division exit, okay? And if you remember that there are some cranial nerves that have a parasympathetic function. So if we look at the cranial nerves, this would be cranial nerve number 3. Does anybody remember what cranial nerve number 3 is? Ocular motor, excellent. So this would be, we'll just put cranial nerves, right? So this would be the oculomotor. Now remember that the oculomotor does have a somatic function, right? So it allows you to move your eyeball because it innervates the skeletal muscle. But in the ANS, we're looking at what it actually does to the smooth muscle and to the glands. And so if we look at the oculomotor, it specifically causes your pupils to constrict and your lenses to bulge. So pupils constrict. Okay, so the iris is a smooth muscle. So pupils constrict and the lens bulges. And when the lens bulges, that means that you're looking at something close up. So the ability to focus on an object that is close to your eye is actually parasympathetic. So this is close vision. Okay. So cranial nerve here, number 7, that is the facial nerve. So if we look at what it is innervating, for example, it's the lacrimal gland, right? And so it causes tearing, so it helps to produce tears that lubricate the eye. But it also innervates if you notice right here, this branch right here, it also innervates the salivary glands. So the facial nerve innervates the lacrimal, so this is tears, and also the, submandibulary or submandibular salivary glands. Okay, so this facial nerve would release acetylcholine into the synapse with these glands. And in this case, would acetylcholine be excitatory or inhibitory? Excitatory, okay? Because it causes those glands to release their substances via ducts into different areas, okay? Then we have cranial nerve here, right? So this is number 9, right? And so do you remember what number 9 was? Yes, the glossopharyngeal. Pharyngeal. Okay, so think about the tongue is glossopharyngeal is the throat. Now this controls swallowing, right, and the movement of the tongue, but that's skeletal muscle. So with the glossopharyngeal, the parasympathetic function would be the parotid glands. And does anybody remember the parotid gland is actually a type, actually we haven't talked about it. The parotid gland is another type of salivary gland. It's the largest salivary gland you have, and it's like right here in your cheek region. And when you get infected with the mumps virus, that is what causes the parotid gland, focuses on the parotid gland, so it causes people to look like chipmunks, because it swells up when it's infected with a virus. Okay, so that's salivary as well. And then cranial nerve number 10, you should remember that one. That's the vagus nerve. Okay, so that means vagabond. So that's the one, the only one that extends down beyond the neck region in its effects. And so 90% of all parasympathetic fibers, and so remember, parasympathetic fiber means axon. A fiber is the same thing as an axon. Travel via this nerve. So this is a really important one. So you notice where it goes. It goes to the heart, it goes to the lungs, and it goes to the digestive tract, the majority of the digestive tract. So heart, lungs, digestive tract. Okay. Notice what it doesn't innervate, which is this stuff that is down here below and is coming out of the sacral region. So if we look at the sacral region, these would be spinal nerves that have traveled down via the cauda equina and are leaving the sacrum via those little foramen, right, in the sacrum, the foramen that allow the spinal nerves to exit. So we have the sacral region. So this innervates reproductive structures. It innervates the rectum and lower large intestine. And it innervates the bladder and ureters. So when we look at the reproductive structures, it also innervates the external genitalia in the male and the female. And so it is the parasympathetic division in the reproductive response that initiates erection. So parasympathetic is responsible for erection in the penis and the clitoris. We'll talk about the clitoris. The clitoris is deceiving because it looks very small on many of our diagrams, but there's an internal part of the clitoris that is oftentimes not listed that kind of is erectile tissue that surrounds the urethra. Okay, so this is responsible for erection. Now notice that it is not responsible for the final phase of the sexual response, which is ejaculation or orgasm. So ejaculation, I'll put here in parentheses, ejaculation, orgasm. So in females, this would be the contraction of the vaginal walls and sometimes the uterus as well. So this is actually sympathetic. So what I'm going to write here is that the entire sexual response is dependent upon both parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. And it usually these two, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, act in opposition. So like usually one causes one response and the other causes the other opposite response, but this is the only example in your body where you actually have to have one division occur and then another division occur to get the entire response to occur, right? And so this might be why having the entire sexual response is sometimes difficult, right? Because it's got to be coordinated, both parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. Okay, any questions about that idea? Okay, so let's look at the sympathetic, okay? So the sympathetic is sometimes referred to as a thoracolumbar outflow. Okay, so this is the thoracic region and the lumbar region of the spinal cord. So even the spinal nerves that come up in the sympathetic nervous system that come up and innervate the iris of your eye, they actually originate from the thoracic region of the spinal cord. So they do not originate from the cranial region, okay? So if we look at this, we also have what they call communicants between the ganglia. So the ganglia reside close to the spinal cord. Okay, so the axons that come into the ganglia are referred to as the white communicants. Let me see, let me just make sure I have this right. The white ramus, sorry, communicants. Back. So remember that ramus means a branching off, right? So this is a branch. And why would it be called white instead of gray? What does it have? Myelination, right? So the white ramus communicans are the preganglionic axons. Entering into the ganglia. And then we have the gray ramus communicans. So this would be an unmyelinated axon. So these are the postganglionic axons. So they come in and they synapse in the ganglia. So if we look at a diagram that shows this, right? So here we have the center body, right, of the visceral motor neuron, right? And notice that it is in the lateral horn. So this is my ventral horn, or excuse me, this is my dorsal horn right here. This is my ventral horn right here, and this is my lateral horn. So that's where the nerve cell bodies reside. So they come in, and that is called, this is called the white ramus as it comes in, right? So it comes in there, and then it exits the gray ramus and comes back out. And so notice that the synapse between postganglionic and preganglionic neurons occur right in that ganglion, okay? And the interesting thing is that then sometimes they travel up or down and can come out of another region of the spinal cord ganglia. So if we look at here, this one comes in, this is that would be the white matter, right? And then it goes all the way up, and then it exits out here and then goes out to the body, right? So sometimes they travel from one ganglia to another. Okay. So if we look at the diagram, okay, so this represents, right, the cell bodies in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. This represents the cell bodies in the ganglia. And so here you can see that the ganglia are near, right, and these are the white rami communicants are near the spinal cord. Okay. So notice that it would go out to the eye. So if we look at the eye, right, the sympathetic nervous system causes dilation of the pupil. Okay. And we talked about this a little bit, but when you dilate the pupil, you let more light in. So this is a greater peripheral vision. So we say that this is greater peripheral vision. Okay. We also have decreased salivation and tearing. Okay. The sympathetic nervous system would innervate the heart and release norepinephrine. And norepinephrine would be excitatory. So it would bind to receptors and it would cause heart rate to increase. When we look at the lung, right, that would cause breathing rate to increase. In the stomach, that would actually be inhibitory. So this tends to inhibit. So it inhibits digestion. So if we say that the parasympathetic is a D, the sympathetic is letter E. Right? So letter E stands for exercise. What happens when you exercise is due to the sympathetic division. Excitement, emergency, fight or flight, and embarrassment. Okay. So one of your essay questions talks about the dual innervation. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system have dual innervation, which means that they innervate both at the same organ, and they cause opposite effects. Now, there are some organs that are only innervated by the sympathetic system and not the parasympathetic. So we can talk about, I'll talk about visceral reflexes in a minute. We can talk about unique sympathetic innervation, okay? So here I'm gonna put most organs have dual innervation, right? And the parasympathetic and sympathetic have opposite effects. Except for a few exceptions to the rule. Okay. One is blood vessels. Right? So the sympathetic nervous system is the only part of the autonomic division that innervates the smooth muscle. And we can sometimes refer to what is referred to as tone, smooth muscle tone. And so this keeps the blood vessels under a partial state of constant contraction. And this is called vasomotor tone, right? And so if you're going to cause vasoconstriction, you just send more action potentials out to the blood vessel. If you're going to cause the blood vessel to dilate and relax, you would send less action potentials out to the smooth muscle. Okay. So the shunting of blood to the surface of the skin when you're embarrassed is due to which one, vasodilation or vasoconstriction? When you shunt blood, what are the blood vessels in your skin doing? Are they dilating or constricting? Dilating, right? Because when I'm embarrassed, my face turns bright red. That's because the blood vessels have dilated and more blood has flowed into those capillaries, right? So that would cause dilation, okay? We could also talk about the erector pili. Does anybody remember what these are? On the hair. So these are muscles attached to hairs. So muscles attached to hair follicles, right? So when you're scared and your hair stands up on end, that is sympathetic. There is no innervation of those muscles by the parasympathetic nervous system, only sympathetic. Okay. The same thing goes for the sweat glands. So sweat glands are only innervated by sympathetic. And then the same thing goes for the kidney. And the kidney functions in controlling blood pressure, as does the diameter of the blood vessel, so you can kind of remember that. And the sympathetic division causes renin to be released. So we'll put causes renin to be released. And this is a chemical that ultimately causes vasoconstriction. Another organ that is only innervated by the sympathetic nervous system would be the adrenal medulla. So this is the inner part of the adrenal gland. And if you remember, the adrenal gland actually sits right above the kidney. And the adrenal medulla contains nervous tissue that releases norepinephrine and epinephrine. So this contains nervous tissue that releases norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay. So these are not only neurotransmitters, but they're also hormones, right? So these are also hormones. And so they are released into the blood. And have long-term, relatively, long-term effects, right? So if norepinephrine gets released by your adrenal gland, and sometimes they talk about in like, healthy alternative health ideas, is that sometimes people are just producing way too much stress hormones, including norepinephrine and epinephrine, and they call it adrenal fatigue. And so this is the idea that you have like these mini freak out moments frequently. And so for example, you could freak out all the time over little things like, oh God, where are my key cards? Or my keys to my car. Oh God, where's my purse? And you like have these mini freakouts, right? And that's releasing norepinephrine, and then you're just kind of riding these highs of norepinephrine all day long. Well, that's not really good for you. And so they call that, if you're an epinephrine or norepinephrine junkie, they call that, you might get adrenal fatigue, right? You're just so exhausted all the time because your sympathetic nervous system is on high. Right? It's really hard for you to relax, okay? And so the reason is that those are not only neurotransmitters, but they can be directly delivered to the organs via the blood. And so your digestion may be affected, your heart and your lungs might be affected by having too much adrenaline all the time. Okay, so if we go back and we look at the diagram, oops. Okay, so if we look at this diagram here, right? Here would be the kidney, innervation of the kidney. Here's the innervation of the adrenal glands, right? Remember that they also innervate, dual innervation of the urination. The sympathetic nervous system, I'm not sure why, but the sympathetic nervous system actually makes it hard to pee, except if you're like surprised. Like if you're like, I think there's a certain point where you'll just wet your pants if you're scared, overly scared, right? But in general, when you're like, if you're given a presentation and your sympathetic nervous system is high, then that might make it hard for you to urinate. Okay, so people always ask me that because they always talk about, peeing your pants when you're really scared. But generally, the sympathetic nervous system decreases diuresis. Okay. Okay, so like the spinal reflexes, we also have visceral reflexes. And so these are fast responses, right? They don't have to be coordinated by the brain, like the medulla oblongata. So don't have to be coordinated by the medulla oblongata. So remember, the medulla oblongata is our autonomic reflex center, right? But some spinal reflexes are just integrated by the spinal cord. So integration from the stimuli to the response can occur at the spinal cord, right? So if you don't have enough oxygen, for example, it's not getting enough oxygen in your blood, automatically your lungs, the bronchioles in your lungs might dilate. So that would be like dilation of the bronchioles. Right, might be an example of a visceral reflex. Okay, so this increases oxygen consumption. So if we look at these visceral reflexes, it looks very much like the somatic reflexes that we talked about previously. But would this be an example of a monosynaptic or a polysynaptic reflex? Mono, right? And the reason is that, notice in that lateral horn, is there an interneuron? No. How many synapses do we see in the spinal cord? 1. In the spinal cord, that's the only synapse in the spinal cord. This is the synapse in the ganglia. But this is the only one in the spinal cord. That's why they're called said to be monosynaptic. And then it comes out, and then it can go to the visceral effectors. So it could go out to the lungs, for example, and cause them to dilate. So you can breathe more easily. Okay. So that is what is referred to as a visceral reflex. Okay, so I'm going to stop there today because we are going to then next move into receptors, which gets a little bit complicated. Huh? Yes, Sunday there is. I put it up. Yep.